Sound of Economics. I'm Bryn Watkins. I'm pleased to bring you this podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank specialised in economics and economic policy. Now, the Sound of Economics normally focuses on one economic policy topic in each episode, and we explore the subject in detail and look at Bruegel work on the area. But this episode is a little bit special. The Treaty of Rome is reaching its 60th birthday, and all over Europe people are reflecting on the history and the future of the EU. And this is at a time when Europe seems to be facing this unprecedented mix of internal and external challenges. And to mark this moment, we're going for a slightly broader topic in this episode. What is the future of Europe? Now, to discuss that simple little question, I'm lucky to be joined by four of the speakers at Bruegel's event, Conversations on the Future of Europe. I'll quickly introduce them and then we can get down to business. So here with me is Johanna Nyman, an expert on human rights and environmental issues, who was until recently the president of the European Youth Forum. Hello, Johanna.
Hello.
We also have Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Centre for Liberal Strategies, Sofia, and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna. Thanks for joining us, Ivan.
Thank you.
From Bruegel, we have Emmanuel Mourlon-Druol, a non-resident fellow who works on economic history. Bonjour, Emmanuel.
Bonjour.
And finally, we're also joined by Guntram Wolff, who is Bruegel's director. Hello, Guntram.
Hello.
Now, Emmanuel, I'm going to start with you as our historian because it's always good to look backwards before we look ahead. There's so much talk at the moment of all these crises and challenges and disasters that Europe is facing. But as a historian, how do you think the current situation compares with previous periods when the EU has faced difficulties? Is this really the worst we've ever seen?
I think it's probably the most spectacular, but I'm not sure it would be the worst. If you look back actually to the past, you had a number of instances where we had the feeling, Europeans had the feeling, EU policymakers had the feelings that the EU would implode. You could look back in the 1950s when the European defense community was rejected. Many people, many headlines in newspapers were just saying that European integration had ended. And if you look at the crisis of the 1970s with inflation, with monetary instability, many policymakers were just saying that it would unravel completely the European project. It would be the end of the common market as we know it, and that everything would fall apart. So it's certainly the most spectacular because we see that the euro is called into question, that one member state is eager to leave the European Union, but it's not certain that actually it's the most important crisis.
Okay, thank you. Ivan, I'm going to turn to you now to talk a little bit about the future. You've worked a lot on political leadership and democracy is essentially an exercise in collective decision-making, and the EU is a pretty huge, messy example of collective decision-making. When we're faced by all these external challenges and internal disagreements, how much is Europe really able to make decisions? Can it take control of its destiny? And when we're talking about the future, can we choose that, or is Europe just blown in the wind?
I do believe that taking decisions is becoming difficult not only in the European Union. So from this point of view, part of the problem with the European discussion is that any type of a problem, political problems that we face, we contributed to the Union. This is the United States is not a union, and they have their problem with the decision-making tool. And I'm talking only about democratic countries and not talking about others. Obviously, the world has become a much more complex place. And the nature of the decision-making is changing, and who is taking decision is changing. The major difference is that for a short period of time, particularly after the 1990s, Europeans were living with the idea that we know the direction in which history goes, and we were the direction. European Union was basically looking at itself as the laboratory of the future. Post-national state, kind of a different type of a decision-making, different type of a citizen. What in my view is important to this crisis is that outside of the economic or political dimensions, it's a major intellectual challenge. It's basically force you to ask yourself to what extent we are the model of the future to come, or to what extent we are an exception, and basically exception in danger.
So doubt is back, history is back. Johanna, we're both of a generation that grew up during that period where the future seemed pretty certain, and now there's lots of worries for us. You focus a lot on youth issues, and for young people, obviously, the future is important because we have a lot of it to live through, hopefully. What do you feel young Europeans want to be able to hope for the future of Europe?
What we want to be able to hope for I would say it's really a combination of possibilities, participation and solidarity. Right now it looks pretty gloomy for many of us, finding a job, being able to build a stable base, to be able to have a plan for the future, look into family life, what will it look like when we are old. And right now we need to have that kind of possibilities to really build our lives. But also to participate. Today in Europe we see that there are quite some obstacles for young people to participate in decision making, and there needs to be a flexibility from the decision making system and a willingness to take in our views and our perspective. And that brings me to solidarity. We see kind of a split between generations today as well. Personally, I feel somewhat disappointed with previous generations and their way of building a very unsustainable European project. And what we look for is solidarity across this gap and making sure that we do have possibilities to build a stable future for ourselves.
And finally, Guntram, so you work on a huge range of issues in European economics and governance. And we've already heard some kind of some hopes and some worries there. But for you, looking at the future of Europe, what do you think we can be most hopeful about, and what should most worry us?
Well, look, I think 2017 is a year that can be quite decisive in the sense that last year we've seen Brexit, we have seen President Trump being elected, and the question is really, is 2017 the year where Europe, Central Europe, continental Europe, is actually deliberately choosing a different model, and so choosing in all the elections that are upcoming, choosing to believe in cooperation across borders, choosing and believing that together we can find better answers than each of us alone, choosing and believing to support the global multilateral rules-based system, be it in climate, to fight climate change, like in the Paris Agreement, be it to address issues of global tax evasion. So I think Europe really, and I think those of us who believe in the future of Europe, they are really hopeful that the elections and that we are seeing, and that citizens basically also in the pulse of Europe, I mean that citizens really are saying, well, we actually believe that together we can achieve more than each of us alone, and that the nation state and the national protectionist story is actually not the solution. And I firmly believe that that would be the right answer. Certainly, I believe that the answer that President Trump is giving, slashing the welfare state and raising up protectionist barriers to give hope to its own citizens, I think is not the right way, and I think it will ultimately not fail. It will not be convincing. And so I do think there is actually hope, and it's basically for us to take that opportunity.
So, Ivan, that kind of builds a bit on what you were saying as well. Do you agree there is room for hope here as Europe finds its place in a slightly more normalised world than what we were living in 15, 20 years ago? Do you think there's a place for us to make these decisions?
Sure. First, I don't believe that it makes much sense, economic and others, to be highly pessimistic. Because if you go totally pessimistic, basically there is no chance to succeed at all. I do believe that the question is totally different, and the question is, till now we had the feeling that simply because of the fact that we have the institutions that we have, and that we have made the choices that we have made, it cannot go wrong. And I do believe this is the challenge. In a certain way, it's very much going to depend on the choices that we are going to make now, and not of the choices that have been made 60 years ago that Union is going to develop. The context is changing. The context is not only simply the fact that, of course, we are going to see the decline of the economic power of the Europe in the world, simply because the world is becoming better. Nothing wrong with this. You're going to see a totally different demographic role of Europe in this new world, because there are going to be few Europeans in the world. The problem is how we're doing and how we're going to adjust to this world. Because one of the interesting stories about the European Union, look, 1957 was the moment in which the continental kind of empires like France and others, but to a certain extent even UK, they stopped to see the world in the way it existed. It was not only the end of the World War II, it was also the end of the European empires. And then basically Europe turned to itself and tried to reimagine the world and its role, very much focusing on basically what the European states are doing in Europe and not simply outside of Europe. The major story is that we should try to re-engage with the world, but this re-engagement is going to be in a totally different terms. I don't believe it's going to be easy. I don't believe that success, by the way, and failure is so easy to be defined. And my last point is part of the problem of the EU, and this is why it's so difficult to talk about this crisis, is that the worst and the best is the same thing. For example, look from the point of view of East Europeans. Go on the polls. The things that East Europeans liked most about 1989 was the opening of the borders. The things that they're most troubled about these days is the opening of the borders. Because then you believe that the borders is the one that you can get out now when the others can come in. And exactly this type of ambiguity of the fact that what we love is also what we fear makes it so difficult for Europe even to reflect on some of the problems that we have.
So what we love is often also what we fear. Johanna, that's definitely something what young people would have to think about a lot, because there's...
This is, by the way, also true with youth.
Definitely.
We love them and we fear them.
I think maybe that's a global human topic. So, Johanna, what do you think it is on a more kind of concrete level now that young people really want to see from Europe, and also see from Europe as it finds its place in a wider world? Because it's interesting. I mean, we could talk for hours about colonialism and young Europeans and their relationship with it. We don't have time, but what do you think young people really want from Europe on a concrete level, and how should they go about getting Europe to do that?
Yeah, so in one way, my generation is a little bit in a paradoxical situation, because we are really Europe positive. We are in favor of the European Union and the European cooperation. On the other hand, this cooperation has to some extent also led to the situation we are in today, with 19% of young people being unemployed, very bad possibilities when it looks into building a future, big probabilities of falling into poverty, exclusion, so on. So I think what the European Union needs to do now is really to show some initiative and start transforming the realities of young people into something better, into giving us basically those possibilities, making sure that we have access to quality jobs, access to housing, access to really good education, but also access to mobility. And that is, I mean, it's not an easy thing, but this is what we need right now, because without focusing on the well-being and the rights of the individuals, I do believe that this project has failed.
Perhaps I can react to what Johanna said. I think what, of course, it's the core question is, can we give jobs and can we give a future to our youth? And I would totally agree that the results have not been good enough in the last 10 years at least. Now, I think the big question is, who's the actor here? I mean, and we should be very careful distinguishing between the European Union and distinguishing also between the member states. And if you look at, for example, spending on education, I mean, that is national spending. Spending on investment, it's mostly national spending. And I think one of the sad stories of certainly this crisis has been that despite promises to the contrary by all the member states that we would not cut spending on the young, we would not cut spending on education and investment, but we would rather do the budgetary adjustment that some of us had to do on basically old pensions and so on. Despite these promises, the opposite happened. So the demography actually, the electoral demography also played a huge role, that a lot of the spending went basically to, so pensions were not cut, or not so much, while basically the money for the young people were cut. And I think that's one of the big tragedies, and we have to be very careful thinking about who has been the actor in which country here, really.
Emmanuel, there's this story there, then, this balance between the national, the nation state as the actor and the EU as the actor, and also a balance between institutions and then the people. Do you think the story of the EU so far has been one of this definite shift towards the EU that's been ultimately disappointing, or is there something more complex there?
There is clearly a shift towards centralization, very obviously. If you look at the period from the early 1950s, we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Treaties of Rome, but actually arguably the supranational integration of Europe started in coal and steel in the early 1950s. So there is a growing centralization of a number of competencies throughout the past 60 years, starting with coal and steel, then moving to currency, then to banking union, and then still need to be completed in other type of policy areas. Having said this, there is one constant that I think you can find throughout history since 1957, is that basically the institutional result is always a hybrid construction trying to mix different interests of the supranational level and member states, of the people and the governments, of different economic theories. If you go back to the creation of the Treaties of Rome, there were many different economic theories, the most famous one between German order liberalism and French planning. And we're all going through this history, and it always ends up as actually we need to say it should be. We are all Europeans, and we have very different backgrounds, and we need to try to organize ourselves with very different ideas. And so it makes sense that even though there is probably a line to draw towards centralization that is not necessarily a given, we still have a hybrid construction in the end that is mixing very different traditions.
And Guntram, do you think, is that sustainable in the long run? Can you have these hybrid constructions looking to the future of Europe? And also this, on an economic policy level, this real hybrid culture of different regions, essentially, whose economies behave in quite different ways?
No, I think this is certainly the central question for the future of Europe and for the future of the Eurozone in particular. I mean, the Eurozone is a construction that puts together countries with very, very different economic models, very different economic strengths and weaknesses. And it seems to me that a monetary union that is very sort of based on very divergent real economies ultimately will face many, many significant challenges. And so I do think that fixing monetary union and fixing the remaining issues and contributing to real economic convergence, which also means not just the European level institutions, but also means, addressing some of the fundamental problems in some of the member states, I think is one of the priorities for the future of Europe to look bright. And so far, I have to say, we are only halfway through on what has to be done at the Eurozone level. And so I actually am worried. If you ask me about what I'm most worried about, I think I'm actually most worried about this real economic divergence that we are seeing with very different performances across the EU member states and the Eurozone member states in particular.
Well, it's clear there's a huge amount still to discuss about the future of Europe, but we're hosting this event and having this discussion here for the podcast because it is the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. We're going to do a little bit of a thought experiment now. If you could go back 60 years to the Europe of 1957, what would you tell a European citizen that the Treaty of Rome was going to mean for them? So if you were in a time machine, you've got the advantage of living now, but you were going to go back and tell people what Rome was going to mean for them, what was the one thing that you would say? Ivan, what would you tell someone?
I'm going to tell them that the first 60 years are going to do fine. The problem is that then the retirement age should be increased.
Johanna, if you could go back to a young person in 1957, the kind of people who are now our parents, what would you tell them they could expect?
Well, I would tell them that this is a really great step forward, but they have to be extremely alert and not let it slide in the wrong direction.
Emmanuel, if anyone should be able to answer this, here is our economic historian. What would you tell someone in 1957 the Treaty of Rome is going to mean?
I would probably say it's a great opportunity, given the past, the conflictus past of Europe. I would probably warn them of one thing, the importance of the legal dimension, in both an optimistic way or a pessimistic way, in the sense that the legal integration, the legal framework that is created by the Treaties of Rome will have a very important impact on the life of everybody in Europe, and that it will probably have an importance that is not necessarily understood very well by the contemporaries, in the sense that many people in 1957 signing the Treaties of Rome while saying, well, look, we're just signing another international trade treaty. Which clearly it wasn't, because there were a number of institutions that would then draw a sort of spillover effect that is very famous for the rest of European integration. And that's where there is an important element to be aware ahead of the developments that came later on, namely that this spillover effect, this legal integration would have an impact in the sense that on the one hand it could be positive, so you could say, well, there is a wonderful tool and the Treaty of Rome is such a very general treaty framework that we could integrate in very many different policy areas. Fantastic. But on the other hand, we have, as a consequence, the so-called democratic legitimacy problem, that it's a sort of lopsided union that is created in the Treaties of Rome, in the sense that you don't really have all the full powers of the European Parliament, you don't have an directly elected executive, and so on. And that will be a very important challenge for the duration of the project.
And Guntram, back in 1957, what would you have told people to expect?
Well, I think I would have said it's a great opportunity to overcome the shadows of the past, but history can come back, and so it's a continuous struggle to make sure that those shadows don't come back.
Excellent point to end our discussion on, because that does indeed bring us to the end of this podcast. Many thanks for listening to The Sound of Economics, and thanks also to all of my guests. If you as a listener are interested in more Bruegel work on European economics and governance, you can find a range of blogs and papers on our website at www.bruegel.org. I hope you'll join us again for The Sound of Economics. Until next time.